Talk a little bit about what the day-to-day life is like in Vietnam and doing business there, some of the challenges that you face as an American doing business in that foreign culture.
Well, as far as day-to-day life goes, I think a metaphor for the country and probably for doing business too is the traffic patterns in Vietnam. Some have described it as organized chaos. I mean, there are a lot of motorbikes on the road if you've ever seen pictures. And people generally follow the rules as guidelines. And that's often the case. While there's great opportunity in Vietnam, and I've seen large companies and also smaller entrepreneurs have incredible success by getting in early as markets are developing. While the opportunities like that exist, there are some real pitfalls. One of them is that it's a pretty corrupt place to do business, and has been for a very long time, far predating, communism coming to the country. And it's, there's an expectation that people will use their position to receive bribes. And so that makes it difficult for companies. But we would constantly counsel companies on a number of really practical strategies that they can use to avoid corruption. And the embassy really was working very closely with the government of Vietnam to implement some programs, as were other partners, to alleviate corruption, particularly in the commercial environment, because it's a real impediment to investment. Now, if you look at the investment that's coming in, plus the number of companies doing business there, you would say Vietnam is making progress. But they need to continue to do so through some of these programs.
Beyond corruption, what are some of the challenges that companies face? I think you mentioned earlier the need for a partner on the ground.
Right. There is a lot of administrative red tape still. But, doing business in Vietnam, like a lot of Asian countries, really requires a relationship. It's impossible to get any kind of project off the ground without being on the ground in Vietnam, developing relationships with people. One element of the economy there that's a little different from some of its neighbors is the big role that the government plays. I mean, as compared to China, where state-owned enterprises make up about 20% of the economy, in Vietnam it's still about 36%. So you have multiple relationships that you need to manage. Even if you're in a sector where there's not a large government player, you need to make sure that you're developing relationships with regulators, ministry people, in addition to business people that you can trust. And so, that's an element that's a little bit different than maybe what most business people are used to.
Is Vietnam in the consciousness of American companies that are looking at Asia?
That's a great question. I've been here in Atlanta for 4.5 months, and it's been an interesting experience. I've counseled a lot of companies about increasing exports to Asia. And it seems to me that there are a lot of Georgia companies that are expert and successful at exporting to Asia, but I often see a gap for Vietnam, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that. One, it's not well understood. They don't really realize how far Vietnam has come. And so, I've kind of taken it on as a personal project to help companies do that, and it's really gratifying for me personally. But it's critical to have a partner on the ground in Vietnam. It's a place where you really need assistance navigating. You can understand what's there. It's possible to understand the environment, but you need a little guidance.
As far as exports, what are some of the strongest areas? Vietnam's population, I think many people don't know, it's in the 80 millions, right?
That's right.
86 million or something.
It's the 13th most populous country in the world. So interesting dynamic going on. I mean, it's still predominantly an agricultural economy, but you have two very large population centers in Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi. There's a lot of migration and rising disposable incomes in the country. Vietnam passed the $1,000 per capita threshold, which is a big marker to move to middle income status. What that means in Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi is that the average incomes are $4,000 to $5,000. So people have more disposable income, and you can see the consumer goods companies from around the world coming in to take advantage of that.
We've also seen Vietnam become a sourcing base, not only for manufacturing, but for some IT projects and others. Is that a trend that you're seeing as well with American companies? And what sets Vietnam apart from a place like China?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's both a challenge and an opportunity for Vietnam. One of the real challenges that the American companies always cited was, while I was there, was a lack of IT skill set. The Vietnamese do very well at math, but as far as formal education in IT, they're still fairly far behind. And so both the business organizations and the embassy made education a priority. Ambassador Mahalik created an education initiative. The investors that have come there, Intel, for example, who recently opened a $1.2 billion facility in Ho Chi Minh City, a microchip processing and testing facility, realized early on, about 4.5 years ago when they announced their investment, that to have success they were going to have to get in the education business, because they could not find the engineers, the IT professionals that they needed to really run the game. Interestingly, Vietnam has now become the 7th largest source country for students studying in the United States. And a large preponderance of those are getting into the IT field. So they're playing catch up a little bit, but I think they'll get there. What's interesting is that a recent report I read comparing IT outsourcing in Vietnam with India, which is kind of viewed as the gold standard, puts Vietnam ahead in some specific skill sets and actually in the average income per IT. So if you're a young Vietnamese or of Vietnamese descent, I mean, there's opportunity in Vietnam to work. If you got an IT degree, you can go back and do very well.
So as far as manufacturing, though, are there also American companies looking at that, and is that mainly for cheap labor, or is that something, with the Intel situation, you mentioned they decided to build it and then they trained the workforce. Are manufacturers facing that as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. For a long time, companies have pursued a China plus one strategy. They didn't want to put their eggs all in one basket. Now that's becoming more true than it ever was. We've seen some migration, not just of American companies, but as Vietnam moves up the value chain, it becomes a real incentive for consumer electronics manufacturers. And we've seen in the north and in the south both some clustering taking place there.